Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Lunch with PB&J.
That's me.
That's her. Hey Joy,
Yes.
did you know what today is?
It is episode 20.
Oh,
I'm ahead of you.
she's on it. It is episode number 20. Can you believe that?
No, I can't. Can you?
20 weeks of this.
Boy, I don't know how to take that statement.
Thanks for sticking with us, guys. Hopefully it means that we're figuring it out and doing something. Every once in a while, you guys don't comment online, but you comment in person, so that's nice. We get little private messages and stuff, people listening. All the way down. People looking for us in Tennessee, even. What?
Podcast reached that far?
It's almost like there's a network of interworkings, like a web. I don't know. Anyway, welcome back. We're glad you guys are here. And we are continuing the Bedtime Stories series. And we did not tell you last time because we didn't know where we were going to go, but we have decided now.
Yes.
Good thing because we're about to talk about it.
Yes.
We are going to talk about
Daniel in the Lion's Den. Don't laugh, Joey. Don't encourage.
That was bad. It tickled my throat when I did that. So yeah, Daniel in the Lion's Den.
Yes.
Just like, epic kids Bible story. Like everybody heard this one. Everybody knows this one. What's funny about this is, not funny, but what's interesting about this is I realized again as I read through it that like literally he's in the lion's den for like one verse.
Yeah.
And yet it's Daniel in the lion's den.
Yeah.
And like that's so little to do with the whole story.
Way more to it than that.
There's a lot more to it. So we are going to jump in and we're going to talk about Daniel and in the lion's den. And I think we're ready. You ready?
Give us some backstory.
I will do that. Would you like me to do that?
I would, because I did not study for any backstory.
I have all kinds of backstory.
Okay.
PB got back story. Got her.
How is this going to go today?
Okay. So, what is interesting? First and you with me?
No.
Okay. I lost her. Look, I made her hot. Thinking about anyway. What's interesting about Daniel that you may not know is that the story of Daniel, so the book of Daniel, is actually overlaps with several different books of the Old Testament, specifically some of the Old Testament prophets. So a lot of the prophets were the spokesmen. They told people what God told them to say.
Yes.
Spokesman for God. And so a lot of the Old Testament, or not a lot of them, but a couple of the Old Testament prophets, when they were speaking to the people of God, some of them, they were speaking to the people of God while they were in captivity, which is where the story of Daniel takes place, is the kingdoms had been divided. So the 12 tribes of Israel had been divided into two different kingdoms, and the tribe of Judah, that kingdom has been taken into captivity, right? So what it overlaps with, do you know who it overlaps with?
Jeremiah, for
One,
sure.
That's one.
Ezekiel.
That's another one.
How many is there?
There's one more prophet.
I don't know.
I can't say it.
Habakkuk.
Habakkuk. Look at the way it's spelled. It's Habakkuk. It actually overlaps. So not all of their books, but portions of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all of Lamentations.
Okay.
So that book of Lamentations, which Lamentations means
weeping.
That's right. So Lamentations means weeping, which makes sense because it's talking about God's people being in captivity during that time.
Right.
And so Jeremiah, which Lamentations was written by Jeremiah, right? I'm not off base there.
I think.
I believe so. Pretty sure. Probably should have looked at that before I said it, but almost positive. Okay. Jeremiah wrote that. And so, all of that happens during the time span of the book of Daniel.
Okay.
And also 2 Kings chapter 25.
Cool.
Talks about Nebuchadnezzar, which is the king that ushered all of this kingdom into captivity. So he is the king at the beginning of Daniel's story. So now the other thing about the book of Daniel is that it is written out of order.
Okay.
That's always fun. So the book of Daniel is broken up, and I'll talk about more about this in a second when we get to chapter 6, which is where we're going to read from. But it's kind of it's written out of chronological order. And so what's really interesting, you guys have heard us talk about the chronological Bible before. So a lot of the Bible was written over hundreds and hundreds of years, several different authors, but a lot of them are overlapping in their time frames, and so a lot of what they say interact with each other. So again, what is happening in Daniel, while Daniel is going through his life, he is hearing from the prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel.
Yeah.
He would be hearing what these prophets of God are saying. And so I would really recommend, I bought one a few years ago. I got a chronological Bible. Joy kept stealing it from me. So I got one for her so she can have her own.
Yeah,
but
they're awesome.
It's really, really good. I'm going to hold mine up here for you. You can't read the front. It's dark. There it is. The chronological life. I probably could have just put a link in the Bible or in the notes, but I'm going to show it to you instead.
Life application.
Chronological Life Application Study Bible, and this is we do.
So we are not reading the same translation today.
Yeah, I'm in the New Living Translation.
Oh, okay.
You also are.
Okay.
Just have different notes.
Gotcha.
That's all. But it's really good. And what that does, we've talked about it before, but I'll tell you again, is it just puts everything in just what it sounds like, chronological order. Right. So it'll take, a little bit of Ezekiel and it puts it right in line with what's happening in Daniel and then where Jeremiah jumps in as well. And so it's really, really fascinating and kind of see the whole story come together. So if you've ever read... because especially if you've read some of the Old Testament prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, Isaiah, and sometimes you're like, man, what are these guys talking about? When you put it in the chronological context, all of a sudden you see the specific stories that they are speaking into. Yeah. And it's fascinating. It has been one of my favorite Bible study. I mean, it is my go-to Bible study Bible, just to see it all in chronological
kind of with what you're saying
context.
Recently, I just read Daniel, the whole book, and I was in one of the stories. I forget which one, but I think it's where he fasts and prays for 21 days. But he does that in response to reading the book of Jeremiah or letter of Jeremiah. Yeah. And he does that fasting and prayer to God in response to reading Jeremiah. And it's just eye-opening to me. I thought that was so cool that he's responding to the word of God. And it's kind of like, it makes it make more sense.
Awesome. So, highly recommend. Yeah. It is PB&J's recommended book, Bible translation of the day. All right. So, some more background, okay? So that's just the context of Daniel in general. But here's what's happening. Again, the nation of Israel is divided. Judah is taken into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar is the conquering king. When he goes in and takes them captive, this is during the Persian Empire. So Nebuchadnezzar, he's the king. Babylon, we hear about Babylon all the time, especially in the Old Testament. But it is whenever you hear that is the Persian Empire. So when you talk about all these different empires over the course of world history, so you can read about the Persian Empire outside of the Bible, okay? And that's where it's cool. It all interacts with actual history. Nebuchadnezzar's a real dude. He's not just a biblical dude. You can read about him, okay? But he was powerful. And so when he came in to take them captive, he destroyed Jerusalem, he destroyed the temple. He wanted to make sure that he didn't just take them as slaves, he wanted to crush them. Almost borderline, outside of the fact that he didn't kill them all right away, he did take them captive. It's almost like a genocide type situation where he came in and what he was trying to do is crush an entire race of people, an entire nation, and really erase their history and erase any kind of future that they might have. And so he really wanted to make them absolutely obsolete. That was his goal. Okay. And so some of the ways that he does that, if you read the first few chapters, so Nebuchadnezzar is king during Daniel 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. And if you go back and read the beginning of Daniel in chapter 1, what you'll find is that Nebuchadnezzar calls for, the way it's worded, the best of Judah's noble sons. And so what that means is he wants the who would have become the leaders of Judah. All right. So they were the nobles' sons. And so whoever their next generation of leaders were going to be, he wanted young men between the ages of 12 and 15 that came from the best homes, the most powerful homes. And he brought them into his palace, into his kingdom. And the goal was to indoctrinate them with Babylonian culture, the Babylonian language, the Babylonian religions. He wanted to completely change them because his goal was not simply to crush the current people, but to crush future generations. Right. And I thought this was fascinating as we kind of come into this, because just to recognize that sometimes we sometimes take for granted what is happening to the youth of our generation. And we can look at it and go, oh, it's terrible what our youth are going through. But I don't, we've got to start to understand spiritually what is represented in the youth of our generation, in the youth of our nation, and because the devil attacks the youth because those are the future leaders. Right. What you see as leaders today is a result of what happened in a generation beforehand. And so this is what Nebuchadnezzar is doing, is he's like, I've crushed your spirit. Now I'm going to crush your future. And so the goal was to bring in all of these future leaders and indoctrinate them with his beliefs, his way of doing things, his way of thinking. And they were going to be taught the language, the literature, what to think, even given the king's food and wine. So he's like, we're going to even feed you the way that I'm fed. Like, you are totally going to lose your culture. You're going to lose everything you've ever known, and you are going to become Babylonian. And it was just this fascinating strategy that he had. And I really believe, again, spiritually speaking, it's very similar to the strategy of Satan today. To where Satan wants us to think, behave, and believe the way he wants us to. Right? And so that's what I feel like happens so much in the world today. And if we're not careful, we can just kind of, I think a lot of times we're like, man, we just want our kids to survive. We just want them to become productive members of society. And we're like, okay, maybe we're going to do our best to raise them to know who God is, but they'll make their own choices when they get older. And so this is why it's always been our heart, even from like every church we've ever been a part of, is even starting in kids ministry. Absolutely. We've never wanted kids ministry to just be about babysitting. It is about pouring into these kids from a young age the truth of who Jesus is and the Word of God to take place in their hearts, and then into youth of just never wanting it to just be about fun and games and social interaction, which is important, but is not as important as knowing the Word of God. So even now at our church, we're taking the youth through a book of the Bible. We're taking them through Ecclesiastes, which is just like, sounds like one of the most morbid books of the Bible, and yet at the end of it, Solomon says at the end of the day, here's the deal. Like, obey God, keep his commands, and do it in your youth. Like, do it while you're young. Don't waste your time pursuing all these other things.
And the vision that you're talking about is what we're going to see here with Daniel, where it's possible to have that as a young person.
Absolutely. We see that with Daniel. So this is what's happening. This is kind of what leads up to the story. And what's interesting, again, is Nebuchadnezzar goes so far with these noble sons that he even changes their names. And I talked about this one time. I did a series on the book of Daniel a few years ago, 2-3 years ago now. And this was one of the things that was fascinating to me, because the four main characters that we know in the book of Daniel are Daniel, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All right. And so they all were taken captive. They were all brought in through this system set up by Nebuchadnezzar. And they all had their names changed. And the significance of that was the fact that before their names were changed, all of their names meant something to do with worshiping God.
Yeah.
And then when Nebuchadnezzar changed their names and they got Babylonian names, all their names had something to do with worshiping the pagan gods that the Babylonians worshipped.
Yeah.
And so it was about more than just stripping away their identity, like their natural identity. It was really about stripping away their spiritual identity.
And their purpose, because names have purpose.
Names have purpose.
Yeah.
And so it was before, every time somebody said their name, it was a reminder of who they served.
Yeah.
Now, whenever somebody said their name, their Babylonian name,
Right.
it was a reminder that they were to serve, they were expected to serve these pagan gods.
Yeah.
And so it again speaks to the importance of identity and knowing who you are and who you were created to worship. And so I just always found that really, really fascinating. And then also they were given food, the food of the king. So, and this, I wanted to bring this point up because it's, what it does is this idea of giving them the food of the king, the food and the wine of the king. This led to a really, really important decision that will set up the story of Daniel and the lion's den, all right? And so the significance, because then on the surface it sounds amazing, right? Like the king, you got to know the king has the best food, the best wine. It's going to be incredible. What an experience for these young guys, right? But the problem is that all the food that the king ate had been dedicated to the pagan gods. And so Daniel and his posse, all right? Daniel and the other fellas, they recognized that if they were to eat that, because that was one of the commands of God, was that you were to never eat food that had been sacrificed, and especially not food that had been sacrificed to another god, right? And so they recognized that, and so it led to this crucial moment in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. It says, "But Daniel resolved," that's an important word, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with royal food and wine. So in other words, Daniel made a resolution. All right. He resolved within himself. He decided that he would remain faithful to God as a teenager. So let me clarify. When they were taken, they were the noble's sons. They were looking for young men between the age of 12 and 15. So Daniel, when he gets taken into captivity, for the sake of argument, so I don't have to keep saying 12 to 15, we're just going to say he was 13. I don't know he was 13. He might have been 12, 13, 14, 15. He's 13 for our purposes today, okay? So at 13, 14 years of age, I know I can't get away from it. At 13 years of age, Daniel says, I'm not going to eat that food.
Yeah.
Because that would be, I would be sinning against God. And so I intend to keep myself pure and clean and holy before God, even in the midst of what I'm facing right now.
Yeah.
And this is an incredible, I mean, can you imagine? All right. So just bring it, fast forward to today, and imagine a 13-year-old making a decision, making a declaration, not just to his friends, not just to his family, not to his youth pastor or pastor, not in front of the church, in an environment where he has been taken into captivity. He has been forced away from his family. His name has been changed. They are indoctrinating him with new things to pull him away from the God he's been raised to worship. And then given this incredible food, this silver lining is that he's given this incredible food and drink. And instead he looks at it and goes, no.
Yeah.
Because that would defile me before God. And at 13 years of age, Daniel makes a resolution. He resolves in himself. He predetermines that I'm going to do nothing that would separate me further from my God. I will live a life of faithfulness. I will live a life of obedience. And I will live a life of submission to God.
And don't you think that becomes the foundation of the rest of Daniel? You know, the stories of Daniel becomes this foundation point. Absolutely.
And so I think it's just incredible that no matter how much indoctrination is thrown at Daniel and these other boys, because these other boys are the ones that went through the fiery furnace. They wouldn't bow down before the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. And so they get thrown into a fire. Why? Because they had a resolve
Right.
that they're going to worship no other God. So these guys are living according to the law of God, even in captivity, even with all of these pressures.
Yeah.
And this is what's amazing is because in our society and in our culture today, it's very common for people to say, well, you just don't understand the pressures that are on, the peer pressure
Right.
that teenagers are facing today. And I get that. All right. I was a teenager one time too. I went to high school, I was there. So I get it. But I think it pales in comparison. Daniel is being groomed. He is being indoctrinated and groomed. His entire life his old life is being cut off, and he's being groomed
Very
to
intentional.
like where they were trying to get him is to a place where he would even have a government job.
Yeah.
Like we are going to cut you off. We are destroying your culture. That's what we're doing. We're cutting you off from the old, and we're creating a whole new life for you. But Daniel resolved to be faithful. And I think it's an important thing to see, because I think we need to have greater expectations for our youth and for our kids. As parents, we have greater expectation for our kids that they can make these choices now. There's no reason they can't make the choice to serve God now. And despite what is being pressured for them to believe and to think. The difference is we have to make sure that we are giving them the opportunity to know who Jesus is.
Yeah. It actually makes me so much wonder, like, who were his parents?
It does, yeah.
What kind of people were they,
So Daniel, and I'm going to keep using this term as we go through this, but Daniel predecided. He predetermined what he was going to do before he was faced with temptation, before he was faced with pressures. He predecided what he would and wouldn't do.
Yeah.
He set boundaries. He set, he set his mind that I am going to obey God first above everything else, and that's all that's going to matter.
Yeah.
And that's what he lived his life by, and that's what we'll see as we continue through the book of Daniel.
Yeah.
And I think it's just something that we need to learn as we go as well. All right. So that's the backstory, kind of leading up to it. A couple other little things. We're going to jump to Daniel chapter 6 is where this story takes place. The other interesting thing about Daniel is it's not written in chronological order. So what I mean by that is this story, because it's found in chapter 6, you would think it's kind of earlier in Daniel's life. But Daniel, he gets taken into captivity around 13. This story actually takes place when Daniel's about 80 years old. So it's about 60 years-ish.
And he goes through like 4 kings or something?
During his entire time, he goes through 4 different kings. So Nebuchadnezzar is the first king that he gets taken into captivity under. Nebuchadnezzar is the king during chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, as I said. And then Belshazzar. I like that name. Belshazzar.
Isn't that another name
And
for
this
the
is
devil?
this is no, it's not. It's something similar, but what's interesting, and this is what will mess you up when you read Daniel, is Belshazzar is the king in chapter 5 and then 7 and 8. So it skips a chapter and then he picks up again. So if you're reading Daniel just the way it is in your regular Bible, you're going to be like, well, Belshazzar is king, now Darius is king, now Belshazzar is king again? Wait, now Darius is king again? And so it can be a little bit confusing, but it's because it's not written in chronological order. It's almost more of just a collection of the time, Daniel's time in captivity. And so you have Belshazzar as king in chapters 5, 7, and 8. Darius is king in chapters 6 and 9. And then Cyrus is the king in 10 through 12, which are the chapters that really focus on kind of end time prophecy and things like that as well. So that's really interesting to check out as well. All right. So as of right now, Darius is the king. He is the 3rd king that Daniel has served under since coming into captivity. And we'll start there in verse 1. It says, Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interests. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Wow. The whole empire. So, okay, a couple things. Number one, Darius, he's the king. This dude was an organizational mastermind. Like that was his thing, okay? And so he comes in, and again, it is the Persian Empire. It's not just Babylon, it is the Persian Empire. Mm-hmm. And so he has this idea of, I'm going to break it up into 120 provinces. We're in Canada. Think of provinces, okay? So he divides it into 120 different regions, provinces, and over each province, he places a high ruler, I think is what they call him, or a high officer. Mm-hmm. And so it's one person to kind of oversee that area. And then from there, he takes 3 guys. Daniel is one of them. He takes 3 guys and says, you're over those 120 high officers there, okay? So kind of 40 per guy. But then you go a step further, and Darius is just like blown away by Daniel. Daniel is just the man, all right? And so he takes Daniel and he says, not only are you going to help me oversee these 120 provinces, you're going to help me oversee the overseers. Mm. And so that's
a big deal.
That is a big deal. And their role, these 3 administrators, Daniel and these other 2 guys, their role was, one, to protect against rebellion, which I found this fascinating because Daniel was taken into captivity. He was forced into captivity. He's indoctrinated as a teenager. He's given this position in government, and then he works his way up and is given such a high position of power that if he wanted to lead a rebellion, he was in a perfect position to do it. And yet he is given all of this responsibility to protect against rebellion. Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting and speaks a lot to the character and integrity of Daniel. Right. And you may go, well, maybe he just turned traitor and, was now a Babylonian. You've never read the story before, have you? All right. So it was to do that. It was to levy taxes and then to be responsible for the finances as well of all these areas. So that was his role. So there's 3 admins, but again, Daniel is over the administrators. Mm-hmm. So let's keep going. Verse 4 says, then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs. But they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion.
That's good stuff. That's all they got on him.
Yeah.
So when I read that portion there, the 6th chapter, verse 3, where it says, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. I wrote down, it just kind of made me give me this visual of, do you want to work your way up the ladder, so to speak? And this idea of success. So Daniel had great success. And it's this idea of, do you want to work your way up the ladder? A lot of people are in, business situations or things like this, and that's their goal, is to work their way up the ladder. And I just got to thinking about, like, the world tells us that you're going to have to lie, cheat, and steal to get to that position, to get your way up the ladder. But here we see Daniel, they list his attributes. He's faithful, responsible, and trustworthy. Mm-hmm. And it just kind of blows my mind because it's the total opposite of what the world tells you to do. Total opposite. And so that stands out, that's how he's making his way up the ladder. I read some verses that kind of went along with this, but it's Proverbs 2:7, and it says, he holds success, he holds success in store for the upright. He is a shield to those whose walk is blameless. And it just shows you that, like, if you want success, if you truly want success, then if you're living a life that's upright, if you're living a life that's faithful and responsible and trustworthy, just like, Daniel is here, that you're going to be successful. Yeah. And it's just totally against what the world says. Yeah. But by God's standards and his word and his truth, Like, he's going to make you successful.
That's good. Yeah.
And it doesn't always look exactly what the world thinks is, you've mentioned this before. What the world calls success is not always what, we would call success. But it can mean money. It can mean these things. It can mean wealth. But more than all that, like, it's the true riches of just being a good person and being, having joy, having peace, having integrity, and that gives a person success in their life. But that stood out to me, that part.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, and I think it is. I think it's important to understand, again, because Daniel's just another one of so many stories in the Bible where seemingly the circumstances are tragic. So you have this young man who's torn away from his family, taken away from his home, stripped of his name, his identity, you could almost say.
Yeah.
He is stripped of his culture. He is they have attempted to take away everything he has ever known. And so you could look at all that and go, oh my goodness, this is a travesty. Like, this is so tragic. This is such injustice, right? Yeah. And you could have this little pity party, but what you see throughout the Bible, and this is just another one of those stories where God consistently elevates people that are in these circumstances, where he uses these circumstances even. And I think I read somewhere, I can't think where, it might have just been at the beginning of Daniel, or it might have been in Kings where I read it, but it said, like, God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to do what he did.
Yeah.
He allowed him to take his people into captivity.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's another story for another day, okay? But like, you see that and you go, oh my goodness, how could God do that? And yet this is one of those stories where, again, it's like the story of Joseph, where God tells Joseph, one day you're going to be in a position of power. Little did Joseph know that he was going to be sold into slavery and then thrown into prison, and all these things were going to be happening. But yet every step along the way, it says, I've always loved that story of Joseph. Every step along the way, it says the Lord was with Joseph.
Yeah.
The Lord. So he's sold into slavery. He becomes head of all the slaves. He gets accused of a crime, thrown into prison. He becomes head of the cell block. Like, he's in charge of all the prisoners. And then he's, like, forgotten and left in jail for a while. And then finally he gets brought before Pharaoh. And then next thing you know, he's second in command of all of Egypt.
Even in bad situations, he can see God's hand in it.
And I say next thing you know, it was 20 years. All right? It's not a quick thing.
Right.
So it's been like 60 years or so here for Daniel.
Yeah.
But it's this thing where he had this resolve to remain faithful. And so God takes him from this teenage boy who's lost everything all the way up to being made over the entire empire. It's just amazing to watch that. And so this is what's happening. And I think what's important to understand too is that he did all of this without conforming to the culture around him, without conforming to the ways of thinking of his captors. Captors. I said that weird. And so, because sometimes we think I'm trying to put all these stories into, like, modern day context.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we think that in order to get ahead, then we have to conform to the ways of the world.
Right.
If everybody else is lying, cheating, and stealing their way to the top, if everybody else is cutting corners and doing what they do and little wink, wink, nudge, nudge to get a deal done, then that's what we have to do to get ahead as well. Yeah. But Daniel is proof that when you make a resolution that I am going to live my life with integrity and conviction to God, God's going to get me ahead. It's going to be God that gets me ahead. And we're going to see why. At the end of this story, we'll see why God does that. But it's this thing of, we don't have to conform to our circumstances. Right. We are not held down by our circumstances. We are meant to remain faithful, to be resolved to remain faithful to God, and not just to survive, but to thrive within our circumstances. Right. And that in a nutshell is the story of Daniel. Right. His entire life. Yeah. This guy's in captivity. He's never not in captivity during this time. We're even reminded in a moment here.
Sometimes you forget that when you're reading it.
That's what I think is interesting. We'll read it here in a minute, that that Daniel's accusers eventually come and go, that captive from Judah.
Yeah.
And they call back his past.
Yeah.
And they remind him that, hey, this guy's not one of us.
Who they're talking about is the person who's over the whole empire, other than the king.
Yeah.
But then they call him that.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. And so, but again, we note here, so these guys are jealous. Yeah. Basically, it comes down to that. They're jealous. They're upset that the king, that Nebuchadnezzar Darius, wouldn't give Daniel all of this power. And so then they come after him. And they try to find something against Daniel. But as you said, they can't find anything.
Yeah.
And why? Because Daniel has integrity.
Yeah.
He's living his life with integrity. And I think it's also important to understand that, when we choose to live our lives according to the Word of God, when we choose that we are going to be representatives of God, we're going to live our lives the way that God calls us to live them. And as we start to move forward in our life, and as you said, success doesn't always necessarily look like money and job promotions and all those things. Sometimes you just have something that somebody else wants. Sometimes you have the marriage.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just have this incredible marriage where you may not have all the bells and whistles and toys and big houses and fancy cars and all this stuff, but you have this marriage that is God-centered, and there is love and sharing between the two of you. And other people see that, and they will do whatever they can to try to tear that marriage apart. The devil's going to do that, and he's going to use people to do that. You might have the kids that show you love and honor and respect and obedience, and people are going to try to pull that down. They might see joy and happiness and peace and all these things, and they just want what you have. And if they can't get it because they're not willing to do what it takes to get it, which is to serve God,
right,
then they don't understand why you just won't conform to what they're doing. And so because they can't tear you down, or because they can't come up to your level, they're going to try to bring you down to theirs. Yeah. And I think that's what happens so much. It reminds me of, I heard this story one time, and I don't know if it's true, but we're going to go buy some crabs after. We're going to go get a big bucket of crabs after and test this out, all right? But I heard this story one time, and they say, like, when you throw a bunch of crabs into a bucket, those crabs will try to crawl out of that bucket. And they'll do everything they can to get out of that bucket. And so they got these long crabby arms, and they'll reach up and they'll grab one of the top, and they'll start to pull themselves up, and they will stand on top of each other. And it's one of those things that if they would work together, they could probably get their way out of the bucket. But instead, if you throw a bunch of crabs in a bucket, what they'll do is as one starts to climb up, another one will reach up and grab it and pull it down and climb on top of it to try to save itself.
It's like they're sabotaging each other.
They're sabotaging each other. And I think that's what happens in the world a lot, is people are like, listen, if I can't get out, then you're coming down. I'm going to pull you down where I am. And so that's what happens with these guys, is they see Daniel getting what they think they deserve. Yeah. And instead of living lives of integrity, faithfulness, and it doesn't say they had all those things. It said Daniel had all those things. And so instead of trying to rise up to Daniel's level, they can't bring him down. So they're just like, you know what? We're going to create some conflict. Yeah. We're going to just create conflict. And so they have to go after Daniel, the only place that he's vulnerable. So let's read that in verse 6. It says, so the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, long live King Darius. We are all in agreement. We administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue.
Yeah, I can hear it.
Kind of kissing up, all right? And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed. An official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law.
Yeah, you read that from like this was the 6 to the 9 there, and you just see Darius getting himself in this trap, right? And the trap is his own pride, because he's got all these people, these people surrounding him, and just like the kissing noises, they're kissing his butt, you know, And it's this, you just see this kind of this image of them stroking his ego. Like, and you even hear it like thinking, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah, you should worship and pray to me for 30 days.
Who doesn't want to be worshipped for 30 days?
Good idea.
It's amazing.
But he lets these people, because let's be honest, and we can see it clear, they don't care anything about him.
No.
This is not about them showing honor to their king. This is about them getting what they want.
Yeah.
So it's this thing of he gets caught in this trap of his own pride. And I think it just shows, it's like, it should be a lesson to us to be so careful about the pride in our own life, because, I think different people have different things that maybe is a weakness to them. But I think pride is a universal weakness for so many people. Yeah. And the reason to me it is because, it was the way the devil fell. He fell out of heaven.
That's good. Yeah.
Because it was like, hey, I want everybody to worship me instead of God. I want to be worshiped like the Most High. And so his pride, his ego got to him, and this is how he fell out of heaven. So I feel like because this was the devil's fall, this is why it's also so prevalent among people, and this is how he attacks us so much of the time. So it just makes me see that we have to be so careful.
Yeah.
That it's so easy to fall into this of somebody telling you something you want to hear.
Absolutely.
And that's what they were doing here.
Yeah. And I think what stood out to me in these verses too, and again, I try to bring it all into context for us and what can we learn from it.
Right.
And I think you got to highlight the fact again that they're trying to come after Daniel. They can't find anything wrong with this dude.
Yeah.
And so they finally come to the conclusion the only way to get him is to go after his faith. Mm-hmm. Is this guy is devout. Mm-hmm. He is devoted to God.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to get rid of him, we have to figure out a way to use that against him. Mm-hmm. And it struck me, probably strong enough to say convicted me a little bit with this question of, if somebody wanted to attack you, if somebody wanted to attack me, would the only thing they'd be able to find, would it be my faith? Mm-hmm. Would it be this thing of, okay, we want to get rid of Ben. I want him out of the picture. Mm-hmm. I want him out of the way. But man, dude never lies about anything. He doesn't cheat anything. He's faithful to his wife. He's he's a good dad. He doesn't abuse his kids. He's been great with people. He doesn't, all these things. Man, the only thing we've got is he is devoted to God 100%. Mm-hmm. How can we use that against him? Mm-hmm. And that's what they do to Daniel. And I think that's if you wonder, are you living a life of integrity and character?
Yeah.
That's a good litmus test right there, is to go, okay, say somebody wanted to blackmail me, right? Say somebody wanted to entrap me with something that would get me, quote unquote, canceled in today's culture. Yeah. What would they have against me?
Yeah.
What
really makes you take a good look at yourself, right?
Yeah. And so I think it's this really fascinating question that it's the only thing. And so it's this idea, if somebody wanted to get rid of you, could they do it by threatening your time with God? Because that's what they were threatening with him here, is he was devout. He was resolved. He was determined that he was going to spend time with God every day.
They knew that was the one thing that he would not break.
He would not break that. Mm-hmm. He would not change that. Mm-hmm. And so they said, this is how we're going to get him. If somebody came to you, imagine this, okay? Because this sounds like a far-fetched scenario, because we live in Canada, we live in North America. Most people watching or listening to us, they live in North America somewhere. And this sounds like a far-fetched scenario, but without trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist or doomsday sayer or anything like that, guys, there's scenarios happening now, right now, where if you stand up for your faith, you may lose your job. Yeah. Or you may, another pastor in Canada got arrested today because he held church out in Alberta. Mm-hmm. He held church and broke restrictions and all that. And I'm not going to get into that argument with anybody here, but he's standing up for his convictions and going okay. Like he knew that they were coming,
Yeah.
and he said, I think I'm probably going to get arrested today, but I'm still going to do what I feel like I'm convicted to do.
Yeah.
And so you do that. Would somebody, if you were face to face with that, and had to decide between, am I going to take the consequences or am I going to stay devoted to God? Which one would you choose?
Yeah.
Because this is this position that Daniel finds himself in. He basically has three choices once this law, Darius signs this law into effect. And so now Daniel has three choices. The first one is this. It's only a month. It's 30 days. 30 days. I've been serving God faithfully for 80 years.
Yeah.
For they're not even saying I have to worship Darius. They're not even saying you have to worship Darius. They're just saying you can't worship anybody but Darius.
So what if Daniel was like, okay, God, I'll talk to you in 30 days.
30 days, God. 30 days, I'm going to take a break.
Yeah.
30 days, I'm not going to pray. 30 days, I'm not going to think about you. 30 days, I'm not going to worship you. 30 days, I'm not going to live my life. Like 30 days, it's just 30 days. What's the big deal? Right? He could have taken that position and just said, for 30 days, I'm going to take it off.
And I think that's a huge one that we do today because we say, I'm not compromising that much. They're not saying a year. They're not saying I've got to give up my faith. They're just saying 30 days I can't pray.
Yeah, and or you could look at it any number of ways of, hey, just while you're at work, don't talk about Jesus.
Yeah.
While you're at work, don't pray.
Yeah.
While you're, you could look at it that way. While you're at school, while you're, don't bring your Bible. Don't bring your Bible into the office, sit in your cubicle and read the Bible while you're there. Don't do that. Yeah. Just while you're at work. You can serve God all you want out there. Just don't do it here.
Yeah.
And so those are things that we are faced with, right? His other option is he could have faked it. He could have just hid. He could have gone up. We're going to see here in a moment where he goes home and he prays with the windows open.
Yeah.
He could have went home and shut the drapes, closed the doors, locked them up, and just made sure nobody saw him serving God. Nobody saw him praying to God. Nobody heard him.
Makes me think about the verse 2, and I can't quote the whole thing, but you guys know it, I'm sure. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ.
Yeah. Not ashamed. Yeah. And so he could have chosen to do that. Or the third option, just do what he's always done.
Yeah.
Just continue to live by his conviction, continue to live according to what God put in his heart to do, continue to do what he had predetermined to do when he was 13 years old. He's 80 now. But when he was 13 years old, he said, I will do what God has asked me to do.
Right.
I will serve God above everything else. So verse 10.
Yeah. What does he do?
Hey guys, we're going to call it right there. These bedtime stories, they last for a while. There's a lot in them. So
it's
time for bed, okay? So we're going to call it right there for this week. We're going to pick up next week with Daniel in the lion's den. We're actually going to get all the way into the den, all right? So be sure to join us next week for Lunch with PB&J. In the meantime, if you don't want to miss it, then make sure, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and then hit the little dingy bell up there. That's the notification, and then you'll know right when we post part 2 of this story. If you're listening to the podcast, be sure to follow us. That way we'll show up in your new releases, and you'll never, ever miss an episode, because why would you want to? All right? Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week for lunch right here on Lunch with PB&J.